Welcome to the Palestine Church audio podcast. We hope you enjoy this message from Dr. Ricky Paris. For more great content and updates from Palestine Church, please visit us at palestinechurch.com.
I've been meditating a lot on the book of Esther in the Old Testament. And in fact, that's going to be the theme for our conference, the 23rd, 24th, and 25th, is for such a time as this. You have come into the kingdom, from Esther chapter 4. And so I've been meditating on this, and it started when I was actually, Kevin, after you and Nicole came back, we were visiting them in their apartment up across the street over here, and we were talking, and some things you said stirred in me, and I left your apartment that day thinking about Queen Esther and how we have a place in the kingdom of God. And so when you think about the book of Esther, it was a book in which the Jewish people found themselves living in the middle of the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, which was a great pagan darkness that filled that kingdom. They were surrounded by the Jewish people were surrounded there in Persia. They were surrounded by demonic forces of hell. They confronted darkness every single day of their lives, in their jobs, in their schools, in their government, in the public square. Wherever they went, they faced opposition. They faced resistance. There was tremendous darkness coming against them. And yet, in the middle of that darkness, there was a tremendous opportunity. Because anytime there's opposition, anytime there's darkness, that means there's also a great opportunity for God to show up and show off and do what he does. And the world in which we're living today is filled with great darkness. Darkness that's threatening to undo us, threatening to destroy us. Problems and tribulations and abound politically, economically, socially, culturally, and especially spiritually. But in that atmosphere, God has opened tremendous doors. And I'm telling you, it's the darkness is not just in this nation, it's literally all over the world. This world is standing closer to a world war than it has at any other time since 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. We are standing at the threshold of a cataclysmic, apocalyptic, end-time war. I don't think it has to take place. But we are standing, this whole world, we're standing on a tinderbox. And in fact, I think somebody said that yesterday in the MVI prayer meeting. It's not just in this nation, it's literally all over the world, in every nation around us. But in the middle of this, God is giving us doors of opportunities, tremendous opportunities for us to advance God's kingdom and to advance his eternal purposes here in Palestine, but also in the world around us. And again, in the face of opposition and resistance and trials and tribulations, when those things abound, the opportunities abound even more. But the opportunities are there for us even now to see the kingdom advance and the purposes of God advance. But to seize those opportunities, we have to be willing to risk everything. We have to be willing to risk everything. Comfortable Christian living will not seize opportunities. Comfortable Christian living will look for politicians and military weapons to protect us so we don't lose our lifestyle. But God's not interested in protecting our lifestyle. He is interested in advancing his kingdom and his eternal purposes. Are you with me? Okay. As we look at the story of Esther, we notice that Esther lived in and experienced the blessings and favor of God. Esther lived in the city of Shushan, which was the capital city of the Medo-Persian Empire. And she was living more or less around 50 years after the Babylonian captivity ended, when most of many of the Jews had gone back to Jerusalem. But many of them, and probably most of them, stayed in Persia. And Esther's family was one of the families that had stayed in Persia. And Esther was an orphan who had been raised by her older cousin Mordecai. And Mordecai is an interesting guy. His name means little man, probably because he was just a short little runty-like guy. Probably also because people looked at him and thought, nah, you're not worth much. You'll never be of any significance in this world. But Mordecai didn't care what other people thought about him. He didn't care what the circumstances of the world were like. He set his eyes on God. He feared God, and he walked with God, and he refused to pay attention to the world and the negative circumstances and all that was against him. He was faithful to God no matter what happened. And because Mordecai walked in the ways of God, the favor and the blessings of God were on Mordecai. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 3 says, "Let not mercy and truth forsake you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart, and so you will find favor and high esteem in the sight of God and man." In other words, if you're walking in the ways of God and holding on to the ways of God, his favor is going to overtake you. And because God's favor was on Mordecai, God's favor was also on his adopted daughter, Esther. In Esther chapter 2, I'm going to be just basically giving you a survey of the whole book of Esther, okay? In Esther chapter 2, when the king of Persia needed a wife, he sent out a command to bring the most beautiful women to the palace so he could choose one of them for his wife. And it says in Esther chapter 2, verse 8, "So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan, the citadel or the palace, under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace, into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman, Esther, pleased him, and she obtained favor. She obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her regular allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace. And this custodian of the women, because he had such favor, because he saw the favor of God on her, he moved Esther and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women." And then we go on into verse 15. So what we see is Esther's stepping into the palace and the favor of God. We don't have the scriptures. I'm sorry, just pay attention then, okay? Or do something rare and take out your Bible and or your smartphone. There's 2 people here, 3 people with the Bible, Christy and Daniel and my wife. Probably more. There you go. I love it. I would use a regular Bible, but I can't see it, okay? I need the next one up, for the next largest letters in that Bible would be Braille for me. And so I just enlarged them on my iPad, okay? Verse 15, "Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her." Are you getting this? Everybody looks at her with favor. They're like, "Man, girl, how can we help you? There's something about you that's special." So Esther was taken in verse 16 to King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. In verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. There's a whole lot in those verses that we could mine out of there, but I just want to focus on and observe the fact that Esther, here in these verses, clearly was walking in the favor of God. The evidence of God's favor, the evidence of God's goodness, as we were singing earlier, it was all around her. Everybody wanted to help her, because that's what the favor of God does. People want to help you step into your destiny. They wanted to help Esther step into her destiny. They wanted to pave the way for her. That's what the favor of God does. It brings blessings upon you so that people are like, how can I be with you? How can I spend time with you? How can I help you out? And because of the favor of God, then she was crowned as the queen. She was living a good life. She was living her best life. She was enjoying the favor of God. And she enjoyed the favor of God because it was a spiritual inheritance from her adopted father, Mordecai. But I wanted to, and you might say, well, I didn't have godly parents. I didn't have anybody who prayed for me. Some of you did, but many of you didn't. So does that mean I'm left out of the favor of God? Not at all. Because the inheritance of God's favor is yours. For every one of you in here. Jesus said in Luke chapter 4, verse 19, he said, the Spirit of the Lord had anointed him to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. I want you to know that when Jesus came and he ministered and he died and he rose again, he released the year of Jubilee. He released the year of God's favor on all people. Yeah. He came to take back what the devil had stolen in the Garden of Eden. Jesus came to take back what the first Adam lost. And he has now declared that you are living in the year of the Lord's favor. Can you believe that? Some of you act like you don't believe it. Turn to the person next to you and say, you're living in the year of the Lord's favor. Tell them the favor of the Lord is on you. God likes you. He favors you. He's on your side. Listen, you start believing that, for crying out loud, because that's the truth. Decide you're going to get in agreement with God and stop being in agreement with the world and stop being in agreement with the devil. The Bible says that the favor of the Lord is on you. This is the year of the Lord's favor. This is the inheritance that Jesus has given you. So Esther found herself living in the favor and blessings of God. And I'm telling you, you are living in the favor and the blessings of God. Well, if I'm living in the favor and blessings of God, why am I going through some of the junk that I'm going through? Because there's a reason. Esther not only, just listen to this, Esther not only lived in the favor of God, but she found herself living in a time of great shaking. In Esther chapter 3, the king appointed a man to be his chief assistant, and that man's name was Haman. And because of his position, he was basically like the prime minister of the king. Because of his position, everywhere Haman went, people bowed down to him. They bowed, they honored him, they recognized him. Whenever he came walking down the street, people parted, the crowd parted so he could walk unhindered. But there was one person who wouldn't bow to him, and that was Mordecai. Because Mordecai would only bow to the Lord. He said, I'll only bow before God. I'll only bow and honor my God. And because Mordecai refused to bow, Haman began to hate him and decided to find a way to get rid of him. In fact, the best way to get rid of him would be to kill him. And while I'm at it, Haman thought, I'll go ahead and see if I can get all of the Jews killed. You see, that's what the kings and rulers of darkness do. They want the people of God to bow to the darkness. And don't get too upset with me, but a lot of our leaders in this nation, a lot of the political leaders and media personalities, they want everybody to bow to the darkness. And I'm not just talking Democrats, I'm talking Republicans too. They're all guilty. Don't get me started. They're all guilty. There's none righteous, no, not one. And the sad thing is that most of them are being manipulated by demons that they don't even understand. They think they're doing what they want to do, but they're being manipulated by princes of darkness. And one of the things that the darkness will try to do is to get you to bow before it. The darkness will, and if the darkness can intimidate you to get you to bow down, then the darkness will try to kill you. And the darkness will try to kill the people of God and the purposes of God. So Haman convinced the king to pass a law announcing that the Jews were all to be killed on a certain day. And up to this point, the Jews had lived in this pagan darkness of Persia, but they had lived there with relative peace and security. But now their world was being shaken. Now they found themselves entering into a time of great persecution and tribulation. And because Queen Esther was Jewish, that meant that her world was about to be shaken as well. The Bible tells us that times of shaking and tribulation will come. John chapter 16, verse 33, Jesus said, in the world, I promise you, you will have tribulation. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 3, Paul wrote to the believers in Thessalonica, telling them that none of them should be shaken by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are appointed to this. Verse 4, for in fact, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation, just as it happened, and you know it. Listen, the church, the modern church in America, thinks that these verses are not for us. A lot of Christians I know think, no, we're not called to suffer. We're not called to go through any difficult times. That's not what the New Testament says. That's not the testimony of the Bible. Paul said to the Thessalonians, we told you we would suffer tribulation. We were appointed to this. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12 says, beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. Listen, we should not go around looking to suffer or to have trials. That's called, I think it's called masochism. We don't go around looking for that. But when God permits suffering to come our way, then first of all, recognize that it's not punishment. Listen, if God was going to punish us for the bad things we had done, we'd all be just little piles of dust. Kind of like on Star Trek when that, what do you call it, the thing that sends the people through the stars, through the sky? Whenever that thing messes up, they just end up a little pile of dust. That's what we would be. Transporter. You'd just be a little pile of dust. No, God's not punishing you. But if God permits you to go through times of trials and sufferings, then just recognize that they're a normal part of the Christian life. We've been called to this. I remember somebody telling me one day, hey, brother, you need to stop going down to Mexico because it's so dangerous down there. You put in your time and you were faithful, and now you just need to leave it to the Mexicans because it's so dangerous down there. Are we the only generation that is not called to suffer for Christ? Listen, the Bible tells us that this is a normal part of the Christian life, and rejoice when it does come, because it means if God's permitting that shaking in your life, is because he's got something bigger and better planned for you. The shaking and the tribulations are the windows of opportunity through which God is going to launch you into your destiny of walking in a greater level of glory, a greater level of power, a greater level of his favor. Are you following what I'm saying? I'm not asking if you agree or if you like it. I just want to be sure I'm explaining myself well, okay? So Esther was living in the favor of God, but in the midst of that favor, the shaking came. Now this is where I really want to get to my message. When the shaking comes, you've got to decide if you will use God's favor to protect yourself, or if you will risk everything to serve God's kingdom purposes. When Mordecai heard about the law announcing the slaughter of the Jews, He dressed in sackcloth and ashes and went walking through the streets of the capital city and sat down in front of the gates of the palace in sackcloth and ashes, crying out to God and praying, "Oh God, have mercy." And he kept on and on like that. Until finally some of the people in the palace said, "Hey, Esther, your adopted father is out there making a fool of himself." And so she gathered some clothes together and sent one of her servants with the clothes and said, "Tell Mordecai, you change your clothes and stop acting like this." But Mordecai told the servant about the king's law. And then in chapter 4, verse 8, Esther 4, verse 8, Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king and to make supplication to the king and to plead with him before her people, for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. When Esther heard that message from that servant, she sent that servant back down to the street and said, "You go tell Mordecai," in chapter 4, verse 11, "that all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law: put them to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words. Esther was saying, "Mordecai, do you realize what you're asking me to do? It's suicide. I haven't been called into the king for 30 days. I don't know if he's mad at me. I don't know if he's disappointed at me. I don't know if he's in a bad mood. I don't know what the heck is going on. But if I go in there without an invitation from the king, then I will be put to death unless he extends his scepter to me." Mordecai, you're asking me to commit suicide. No, I can't do this. I'm not going to do this. In other words, she was just saying it's too risky. And it was a risky thing. She was putting her life, she would have to put her life on the line. You know, a lot of people today are willing to serve God as long as there's no risk involved. They're willing to serve God as long as they know that it's not going to cost them money and that it's not going to entail them losing their comfortable lifestyle. They're willing to serve God as long as it's not going to be dangerous for their children or dangerous for the family, as long as it's not going to put their finances and their 401k in jeopardy. I remember years ago, we started Ministries of Vision International in 1990 in Mexico. And then in 1994, the Lord opened a door, and I was going back and forth from being as a pastor here, I was going back and forth between Palestine and Mexico about every 4 to 6 weeks and during those years. And then in 1994, the Lord opened the door for us to go into Guatemala. And so we prayed about it. I prayed about it. Jane prayed about it. I heard God say, "Go." She didn't hear God say go, but she said, I'll go with you. And so I remember announcing it to the church, and the word got around town, and people started coming to me. There were a few people that gave me some encouragement, but you know what most of the words were that I got? "Don't go, brother. Don't go to Guatemala. It's dangerous down there. They're in the middle of a civil war. There's battles going on every day. You're going to move your wife and your babies into the midst of a war zone? Don't go. They're going to rape your daughters." Those were different prophecies that were given to me. Those were really encouraging prophecies, weren't they? They edified, they built me up, they comforted me. All the things that a prophecy is supposed to do. No, they did not. They're going to rape your daughters. They're going to kill you and kill your wife. And I was praying, and the Lord just said, "Ask your spiritual father," who at that time was Don Pablo Manzowitsch. And I remember asking him and saying, "Hey, this is the prophecies that I've gotten. What do I do?" And he said to me, "You know, if God can't protect you in Guatemala, he can't protect you in Palestine, Texas." And the minute he said that, all of that those curses just lifted off. And that was actually one of the best years of our lives, if you want to know the truth. It was a year, we went down there in debt, and we got out of debt on the mission field. That doesn't happen. But God told me, if you'll just go, I'll take care of your finances. I don't have finances. Well, I'll take care of them if you just be willing to go. And he did. Listen, and the week we got there, the guerrillas had broken through the military defenses into the capital city. And we'd be dry, and they were pitched battles between the military and the guerrillas all over the city. And Jane, when I picked her up from the airport and we saw some of those things going on, those battles going on in the street, she looked at me and said, "Where have you brought my babies to?" And because Zach was just 5 years old at the time. And I said, "Well, do you want to go?" She said, "No, we're here. We might as well stay." Like, and I knew she wasn't going to leave. But the point is, what I'm trying to tell you is it cost. We have to be willing to risk our lives. Put that picture up on the screen that I sent earlier. You're about to see a picture of a memorial that is located outside on the countryside, just outside the village of Amersham, England. Amersham is a village just a little northwest of London. And we had gone there one day to visit, just go visiting through that, seeing the sights in that village. And I read about this memorial. It's a martyrs memorial, the Amersham Martyrs Memorial. And I said, I want to go see that. And it's out in a field, and we had to walk a long way up the hill. And that memorial was put there in 1931 to remember the sacrifice of 6 men and 1 woman. They were burned at the stake because they were reading the Bible in English and because they were telling all their neighbors what the Word of God said. And because they wouldn't stop proclaiming the gospel, they were burned at the stake. And that happened in around 1501, 1506, something like that. And actually 2 of those men who died, who were burned at the stake, they made their children, the officials made their children light the fires to burn their parents. And that story like that kind of memorial and that kind of martyrdom happened all over England. In fact, there's a very similar memorial like that in Brentwood, England, which is on the east side of London. And the story is that when the young man, he was 16 years old, when he was burning at the stake, his mother and his brothers were around him crying out to him, "We're praying for you. Don't recant. Don't deny Jesus. Keep holding on to your faith. You'll be with Jesus shortly." Can you imagine a mother saying that to her son? I've met a lot of mothers who wouldn't let their children go to a mission field, let alone be burned at the stake. Listen, we've been given the favor of God. What are we going to do with it? Mordecai responded to Esther and he said in verse 13, he said, "Do not think, Esther, in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" In other words, Mordecai was telling Esther, if you're trusting in the security of your position or you as queen or the security of your money or your home in the palace, then you're going to lose everything, Esther. Esther, your security is found only in the God who called you and who favored you and blessed you and has positioned you where you are so that you could advance his kingdom purposes right now in this hour. And I want to tell you, God has favored us. Even in the shaking that some of us are going through, because I'm going through some shaking. Jane and I are going through some shaking with some situations in our family. With others I know are going through some shakings. Listen, even in the middle of all of that, I see the evidence of God's goodness all around us. His favor is absolutely all over us. God has favored us, though, not so we can have a comfortable, easy life, but so that we can be instruments through which His salvation and deliverance come to our generation and the generations following, here in Palestine and in other nations around the world. I see a lot of people today, though, who are so afraid of turning loose, of losing anything that they have. A young man that I know was called to a certain nation, and he was praying for a wife to go with him to that nation, and he found a wife, and she was so ready to go. But before they went, they had a child, and I said, okay, tell me now, the baby was born, when are you going to go? Because I want to contribute. I want to help support you financially. He said, no, I can't go now. I said, why? He said, because we had a baby, and I'm not going to put my baby in that kind of danger. I'm like, are you kidding me, dude? We lived in war zones. What about the Christians who are living there in that country? And there was no war going on in that country, by the way. Listen, if you're not willing to risk everything for God's purposes, then God will give your opportunity, your calling, to someone else. That's what Mordecai told Esther. This year and next year, some of you are going to find yourself standing at the threshold of the opportunity of a lifetime to step into your destiny. But the opportunity of a lifetime must be seized during the lifetime of the opportunity. Because once that window is closed, it may never reopen. Someone else will get your opportunity of a lifetime. Someone else will step into your destiny and to your calling. And then the sad thing is, when you finally come to die, you will discover you never lived because you didn't step into the purpose for which you were born. You didn't step into God's destiny. You never used God's favor for Him, but because you used it to protect yourself. When Esther heard the words of Mordecai, she said, okay, go in. You get all the Jews together, verse 15, 16. And she said, you fast and pray. I and my maids will be fasting and praying. And I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther was saying, I do not want to miss the opportunity to step into my destiny. No matter how risky it is, no matter how dangerous it might be, I'm willing to risk everything. And if I die, I die. But I will die possessing my destiny. Are you following what I'm saying? And so Esther was willing to risk everything to give her life to be an instrument through which God's salvation and deliverance would be manifested in that land. And because she was willing to take that step, when she walked into the king, he looked at her and he said, Esther, come on in. And he extended the golden scepter. He said, what do you want? Up to half of my kingdom I will give you. Let me tell you, she risked the favor that she had, and she got more than she had ever even imagined. If you're willing to risk the favor that God's given you and use His favor to bring to advance His kingdom purposes, then more favor than you can contain will be poured out on you. And the result of the end of the story is this, that Esther told the king, and the Lord used her to expose the plot of Haman against the Jews. And the king then, in turn, removed Haman, executed Haman, the prince of darkness. The prince of darkness that was influencing the king, that guy was now gone. And Mordecai was replaced. Mordecai replaced him and became the king's right-hand man. And not only that, the king passed a law protecting the Jews. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's in a nutshell. What I want you to understand is that when we're willing to lay hold of our destiny, when we're willing to risk everything to say, God, I will go. I will go. I will go to that neighborhood here in Palestine that nobody wants to go to. I will minister to these people that nobody cares about. I will minister to these kids in the school. I'll do whatever it takes, whatever it is that God is showing. Or God, I'll go to another nation, because there is a call of God on this church to the nations. And it's been quite a while since anybody left this church to go to the nations, embracing that call. But this year and next year, you're going to be presented with an opportunity of a lifetime to step into your calling and your destiny. Use God's favor. Be willing to risk it and use God's favor to step into that place that's not comfortable. And I promise you, the King is going to extend the scepter to you, and more favor than you've imagined will be upon you. And salvation and deliverance will be manifested in Palestine, in your job, in your other cities where God might send you, or in other nations. This is what Esther did. She was ready to sacrifice everything to lay hold of her destiny and to serve the eternal purposes of God for her generation. And that's God's challenge for us today. And guess what? It is an exciting challenge. You can't lose. Well, what if I get killed? What if Esther had gotten killed? So what? We're all nobody's getting out of this world alive. You're going to die. Better to die in glory than rusting out. Are you following what I'm saying? And I think about that a lot. I'd rather die on the mission field than in a hospital in Longview, like I almost did last year. Are you following what I'm saying? This is an exciting life we get to live. These are exciting days. And yes, there's a lot of darkness. And yes, we are at the threshold of a world war and the threshold of this country collapsing. But guess what? Days of darkness are days of glory for the people of God if we're willing to engage with His eternal purposes. Everybody stand.